In the vast and unforgiving landscape of the American West during the late 1800s, few names carried as much weight as Amos Kane. His reputation was not built on wealth, political power, or land ownership. It was forged in dust, gunpowder, and the cold certainty of skill. Across the state of Texas, from the bustling cattle towns to the isolated border settlements, Amos Kane was known as the fastest and most accurate shooter the frontier had ever seen. To understand the legend of Amos Kane, one must first understand the world that created him. The American West of the 1870s and 1880s was a place of rapid transformation. The Civil War had ended, leaving thousands of men without purpose, without direction, and often without hope. The expansion of railroads pushed civilization westward, but the law struggled to keep pace. In the spaces between order and chaos, men like Amos Kane found their calling. This chapter explores the rise of Amos Kane, not as a mythical figure, but as a product of his time. We will examine the historical conditions that shaped him, the skills that defined him, and the reputation that made him both feared and, in some strange way, respected. This is the story of how a man became a legend, and how that legend would one day be challenged by the most unexpected force imaginable. The period following the American Civil War, from 1865 to the turn of the century, is often romanticized in popular culture. However, the reality of life on the frontier was far more complex and challenging than the stories suggest. The United States was expanding rapidly westward, driven by the promise of land, opportunity, and freedom. The Homestead Act of 1862 had opened millions of acres to settlement, drawing families, fortune seekers, and those fleeing troubled pasts. But with this expansion came profound challenges. Law enforcement was scarce and often ineffective. Towns sprang up overnight around mining strikes, cattle drives, and railroad construction, and many existed in a legal gray area. Federal marshals and local sheriffs were spread impossibly thin across territories that spanned hundreds of miles. In this vacuum of authority, individuals often had to protect themselves, their property, and their interests through personal means. The firearm became the great equalizer of the frontier. A Colt revolver or a Winchester rifle could make a small man formidable and a skilled man nearly unstoppable. Marksmanship was not merely a hobby or a sport. It was a survival skill, as essential as knowing how to ride a horse or track game. Towns held shooting competitions, and men practiced their draw and aim with the same dedication that craftsmen applied to their trades. It was in this environment that certain individuals gained reputations as exceptional shooters. Some became lawmen, using their skills to maintain order. Others became outlaws, using those same skills to take what they wanted. And still others, like Amos Kane, existed in the complicated space between, hired guns, protectors for some, threats to others, operating according to their own codes in a world where official law was often absent or corrupt. The gunslinger culture of the Old West was built on reputation as much as ability. A man known to be fast and accurate would often avoid confrontation entirely. His reputation did the work for him. Stories spread through saloons, along cattle trails, and in newspaper accounts that often exaggerated the facts. In this way, skilled shooters became larger than life, their actual deeds amplified by rumor and fear until they became legends walking among ordinary people. Amos Kane emerged from this culture, but even among notable shooters he stood apart. His skill was not merely rumored, it was documented, witnessed, and consistently demonstrated across the length and breadth of Texas. Very little is known with certainty about Amos Kane's early life, which is typical of many frontier figures whose origins were obscured by time, distance, and a deliberate desire for privacy. What can be pieced together from scattered records, witness accounts, and the few interviews conducted with those who knew him suggests a childhood marked by loss and hardship. Amos was believed to have been born around 1848, somewhere in Missouri or possibly Arkansas, though no birth record has ever been definitively confirmed. His family, like many at the time, was likely of modest means, farmers or small tradespeople struggling to establish themselves in the expanding nation. The Civil War, which raged from 1861 to 1865, would have occurred during his adolescent years, a conflict that tore apart families and communities throughout the border states. Some accounts suggest that Amos lost his family during the war, not necessarily to battle, but to the chaos, disease, and displacement that accompanied it. Many young men of that era found themselves orphaned or separated from their kin, forced to survive on their own from an early age. This experience of early loss and self-reliance was a common thread among many who later became significant figures on the frontier. What distinguished Amos from countless others who shared similar backgrounds was his remarkable natural ability with firearms. By his late teens, he had already gained local recognition for his shooting skills. Unlike many who relied on quick reflexes alone, Amos combined speed with extraordinary accuracy. Witnesses from his early years described a young man who could draw and fire with such smooth efficiency that the movements seemed to flow into one another without pause. He was also noted for his calm demeanor. While many young shooters were hot-headed or eager to prove themselves, Amos was described as quiet, methodical, and seemingly unbothered by pressure or danger. This psychological steadiness, combined with physical skill, made him exceptionally effective in situations where others would falter. By the early 1870s, Amos Kane had migrated to Texas, drawn like so many others by the opportunities and challenges of the expanding frontier. Texas was a particularly volatile territory during this period. The state was recovering from the war and Reconstruction. Cattle ranching was transforming the economy, and conflicts over land, water rights, and cattle rustling were common. It was an environment where a man with Amos Kane's particular skills could find both employment and notoriety. Amos Kane's reputation was not built overnight, nor was it the result of a single dramatic event. Instead, it grew steadily through a series of encounters, each of which added to the legend that surrounded him. What made Kane particularly notable was not simply that he was involved in confrontations, many men were, but that he consistently prevailed, and he did so with a level of skill that impressed even those who had no love for gunfighters. One of the earliest documented accounts of Kane's abilities comes from the town of Abilene, Texas, in 1872. According to newspaper reports and witness testimonies, Kane was hired to provide security for a cattle buyer who had been threatened by a group of men attempting to intimidate him into paying inflated prices. When 3 of these men confronted the buyer and Kane in broad daylight on the main street, Kane calmly stepped forward and informed them that violence would not be in their interest. When one of the men reached for his weapon, Kane drew and fired 3 shots in rapid succession. All 3 men were struck, none fatally but each precisely enough to incapacitate without causing permanent injury. The speed and accuracy of the action left witnesses stunned. Local accounts describe how Kane then calmly holstered his weapon, helped arrange medical care for the wounded men, and completed his job protecting the buyer. This incident established several elements that would become characteristic of Kane's reputation. First, his speed was exceptional. Witnesses consistently reported that his draw seemed impossibly fast, as if the gun simply appeared in his hand. Second, his accuracy was precise even under pressure. He hit exactly what he aimed at, nothing more and nothing less. Third, and perhaps most remarkably, he showed restraint. He could have easily ended all 3 men's lives, but chose not to. This pattern repeated itself across Texas over the following years. In Fort Worth, Kane intervened in a robbery, disarming 4 men without taking a single life. In San Antonio, he accepted a challenge from a local shooter who had been boasting of his own skills. Kane agreed to a demonstration rather than a genuine confrontation, and his superior ability was so evident that the challenger conceded immediately and left town the next day. Not all of Kane's encounters ended without loss of life, however. The frontier was a place where conflicts sometimes escalated beyond the point of peaceful resolution. Historical records confirm at least 8 occasions where Kane's confrontations resulted in fatalities. In each documented case, witnesses and subsequent investigations determined that Kane had acted in defense of himself or others, and that those who fell had initiated the violence. What set Kane apart from many other shooters of his era was his apparent lack of desire for conflict. Unlike some who seemed to seek out confrontations to enhance their reputations, Kane was described by multiple sources as someone who preferred to avoid trouble when possible. He was not known to drink heavily, gamble recklessly, or engage in the kinds of behaviors that often led to saloon confrontations. When violence did occur, it was because circumstances left him no alternative. By the late 1870s, Amos Kane's name was known throughout Texas and beyond. Newspapers occasionally featured accounts of his exploits, though he himself rarely gave interviews or sought publicity. His reputation was carried primarily through word of mouth, stories told by cowboys, traders, lawmen, and ordinary citizens who had either witnessed his abilities or heard reliable accounts from those who had. To truly understand Amos Kane, one must look beyond his technical skills and examine the psychological characteristics that defined him. The Old West produced many skilled shooters, but few achieved the lasting reputation that Kane did. What made him different was not just what he could do, but how he approached his abilities and the life that came with them. First and foremost, Kane was known for his emotional control. In an era and environment where masculine honor often demanded visible displays of anger, pride, or aggression, Kane remained remarkably composed. Multiple accounts describe him as speaking softly, moving deliberately, and showing little emotional reaction even in dangerous situations. This steadiness was not coldness. Those who knew him described a man capable of kindness and even humor in appropriate circumstances, but rather a profound self-discipline. This emotional regulation gave Kane a significant advantage in confrontations. Where others might act impulsively out of fear or anger, Kane could assess situations clearly and respond with precision. His decisions were calculated rather than reactive. This trait also made him less predictable than many gunfighters, whose reputations for hot tempers or specific triggers could be exploited by clever opponents. Second, Kane possessed what might be called a functional detachment. He understood his role and his skills without romanticizing them. Unlike some frontier figures who seemed to embrace a dramatic self-image, Kane treated shooting as a craft, something to be practiced, refined, and applied when necessary, but not something that defined his entire existence. Several accounts mention him engaging in ordinary activities, helping to repair a broken wagon wheel, sharing a meal with strangers, playing cards for small stakes, with the same focus he brought to more dangerous situations. This detachment allowed Kane to avoid many of the psychological traps that ensnared other gunfighters. He did not become addicted to the adrenaline of confrontation, did not need to constantly prove himself, and did not appear to suffer from the kind of paranoia that led some shooters to see threats everywhere they looked. He could set aside his identity as a gunfighter when circumstances allowed, which gave him a psychological flexibility that others lacked. Third, Kane demonstrated a consistent ethical framework, even if it did not always align with official law. He had rules he followed, boundaries he would not cross. He would not shoot an unarmed man. He would not accept contracts that involved threatening or harming innocent people. He would not involve himself in disputes where both sides appeared equally wrong. This personal code gave him a reputation for reliability among those who hired him, and a degree of respect even among those who opposed him. It is worth noting that Kane's ethical boundaries, while admirable in some respects, were still those of a man operating outside the law in many cases. He made judgments about right and wrong, based on his own understanding, not on legal authority. This placed him in moral territory that was complex and often contradictory. He could be simultaneously a protector and a threat, depending on one's perspective. Finally, Kane was notable for his awareness of his own legend. He understood that his reputation preceded him, and that it served a protective function. The more people believed in his near-mythical abilities, the less often he would actually need to use them. This awareness led him to carefully manage his public image, not through boasting or drama, but through consistency and selectivity about which jobs he accepted and how he conducted himself. The existence of men like Amos Kane had profound effects on the communities and regions where they operated. Their presence influenced how conflicts were resolved, how justice was perceived, and how ordinary people understood power and safety in an uncertain world. In towns where Kane was known to be present or nearby, certain types of crime became less common. Cattle rustlers thought twice before operating in areas where they might encounter him. Robbers considered whether their potential targets might have hired his protection. In this way, Kane's reputation functioned as a deterrent, preventing conflicts before they could begin. However, this deterrent effect came with complications. The presence of a figure like Kane could also discourage the development of formal law enforcement. Why establish a costly marshal's office or sheriff's department when a hired gun could provide security more immediately and, in some cases, more effectively? This created a dependency on individual force rather than institutional justice, which could be problematic in the long term. Kane's legend also influenced popular culture of the time. He appeared in dime novels, though often in highly fictionalized forms that bore little resemblance to the actual man. These publications, which were widely read across America, helped spread his fame beyond Texas and contributed to the romanticized image of the Western gunfighter. Young men, in particular, were drawn to these stories, sometimes with tragic results when they attempted to emulate skills and bravery they did not actually possess. Within Texas itself, Kane became a measuring stick by which other shooters were evaluated. Men would be described as nearly as fast as Amos Kane, or accurate, but not Kane-level accurate. His name became shorthand for ultimate skill in his particular domain. This comparative use of his reputation elevated him from a real person to a symbolic figure representing the peak of gunfighting ability. Interestingly, Kane also became a figure in local folklore and oral tradition. Stories about him were told and retold, often growing in the telling. Some of these stories were based on real events, while others were complete fiction. Over time, it became difficult even for those who knew him to separate fact from legend. This blending of reality and myth is characteristic of many frontier figures, but it was particularly pronounced in Kane's case because of his actual documented abilities, which provided a foundation of truth that made the exaggerations more believable. While much has been said about Kane's reputation and psychological characteristics, it is worth examining the actual technical skills that made him exceptional. Modern analysis of historical shooting techniques, combined with witness accounts from Kane's era, provides insight into what made him so effective. Kane's primary weapon was a Colt single-action army revolver, commonly known as the Peacemaker, which became widely available in 1873. This was the standard sidearm of the era, favored for its reliability and stopping power. What made Kane different was not his choice of weapon, many carried the same model, but how he used it. First, Kane's draw speed was extraordinary. The mechanics of a fast draw involve multiple coordinated movements, clearing any clothing or holster retention, gripping the weapon properly, drawing it clear of the holster, bringing it to bear on the target, and cocking the hammer while aligning the sights. Most shooters, even skilled ones, completed this sequence in approximately 1 to 1.5 seconds. Reliable witnesses estimated that Kane could complete the entire process in under 3/4 of a second, an almost superhuman speed that gave him an overwhelming advantage in any confrontation where both parties started with holstered weapons. Second, Kane's accuracy was remarkable not just in stationary shooting, but during the dynamic movement of a draw. Many shooters could hit targets accurately when firing from a stable, aimed position. Far fewer could maintain that accuracy while simultaneously drawing, moving, and reacting to threats. Kane's training regimen, which several people who observed him described, involved thousands of repetitions of draw and fire sequences, building muscle memory so complete that his body could execute the motions without conscious thought. Third, Kane demonstrated exceptional judgment about when to shoot and when not to. In several documented encounters, he drew his weapon but did not fire, recognizing that his opponents had hesitated or were backing down. This split-second decision-making required not just physical skill, but cognitive processing under extreme stress, the ability to assess a rapidly changing situation and choose the appropriate response in fractions of a second. Fourth, Kane was ambidextrous in his shooting ability, though he favored his right hand. Several accounts mention him practicing with his left hand, and at least 2 recorded incidents involved him drawing and firing with his non-dominant hand when circumstances required it. This versatility gave him options that other shooters lacked and made him less vulnerable to situations where his dominant hand might be compromised. Finally, Kane maintained his weapons with meticulous care. Firearms of that era were mechanical devices subject to wear, corrosion, and malfunction. Kane was known to clean and inspect his weapons daily, replace worn components promptly, and test fire regularly to ensure proper function. This attention to equipment reliability meant that when he needed his weapon, it performed as expected, a crucial factor that some other shooters, to their detriment, neglected. By the early 1880s, Amos Kane had reached the apex of his reputation. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, at the peak of his physical abilities, with more than a decade of experience and an unmatched record of effectiveness. His name was known throughout Texas and beyond. He could command substantial fees for his services, and those who hired him did so with confidence that he would deliver results. But reputations, particularly those built on violence and danger, are inherently unstable. The same skills that made Kane formidable also made him a target. Younger shooters, eager to make their own names, sometimes sought him out for challenges. Old enemies, nursing grudges, waited for opportunities to strike. The constant vigilance required to maintain his position was exhausting, even for someone with Kane's discipline and skill. Moreover, the West itself was changing. The wild frontier of the 1870s was gradually giving way to more established civilization. Railroads connected once isolated towns. Telegraph lines enabled faster communication. Law enforcement, while still imperfect, was becoming more organized and professional. The era that had created the need for men like Amos Kane was slowly coming to an end. Kane himself seemed to recognize these changes. Several accounts from this period describe a man who had grown quieter, more selective about the jobs he accepted, and more likely to counsel peaceful resolution when possible. He had accumulated enough money to live comfortably without constant work. Some who knew him speculated that he was considering retirement, perhaps purchasing land, and settling down to a quieter life. It was at this moment, when Amos Kane stood at the peak of his legend, and perhaps at a crossroads in his life, that he rode into the small town of Dry Creek on an evening that would change everything. He came for a specific purpose, carrying the weight of his reputation and his past. He had no way of knowing that he was about to encounter someone who would affect him more profoundly than any gunfighter ever had. A child with wide, fearless eyes, who would see him not as a legend or a threat, but as something else entirely. The story of what happened in Dry Creek, and how a single word spoken in innocence could disarm the most formidable shooter in Texas, begins with understanding who Amos Kane was at that moment. A man shaped by his era, defined by his skills, trapped by his reputation, and perhaps without quite knowing it, longing for something his life as a gunfighter could never provide. This is where the legend of Amos Kane reached its turning point, and where our documentary truly begins. Dry Creek, Texas, was not the kind of place that typically attracted attention. Located in the western reaches of the state, roughly 60 miles from the nearest substantial town, it existed in that peculiar category of frontier settlements that were too small to be cities but too established to be called camps. In the spring of 1883, when Amos Kane rode through its dusty main street, Dry Creek was home to approximately 200 permanent residents, with that number swelling occasionally when cattle drives passed through or when seasonal workers arrived for harvest. The town had been founded in the mid-1870s around a reliable water source, a creek that, contrary to its name, flowed year-round thanks to an underground spring. This water made the location valuable in an otherwise arid landscape, and the settlement that grew around it served as a waypoint for travelers, a trading post for scattered ranches, and a modest hub for the surrounding agricultural community. Dry Creek's physical layout was typical of small frontier towns. A single main street ran roughly east to west, lined with false-fronted wooden buildings that housed the essential businesses: a general store, a saloon, a boarding house, a livery stable, a small church, and a handful of other establishments. Side streets branched off irregularly, leading to modest homes, work sheds, and corrals. The entire town could be walked from end to end in under 10 minutes. What made Dry Creek notable in the context of our story was not its size or prosperity, but its obscurity. It was the kind of place where people came when they wanted to be left alone, where questions about one's past were considered impolite, and where the unofficial motto might have been, "Mind your own business." This culture of non-interference made it attractive to various individuals who had reasons to avoid attention, including both those seeking peaceful anonymity and those with darker purposes. It was into this quiet, unassuming town that Amos Kane rode on an evening in late April, bringing with him a reputation that far exceeded anything Dry Creek had ever experienced, and carrying a purpose that would set in motion events no one could have anticipated. Amos Kane did not arrive in Dry Creek by accident, nor was he passing through on his way to somewhere else. He came with specific intent, pursuing information that had taken him weeks to track down. To understand what brought him to this particular town, we must step back slightly to examine the events that preceded his arrival. 3 months earlier, in January of 1883, Kane had been involved in a confrontation in the town of Del Rio, near the Mexican border. The details of that encounter are documented in local newspaper accounts and testimony given to a territorial judge. Kane had been hired to recover stolen property, specifically, a substantial sum of money taken from a freight company's safe. The theft had been executed by a group of 4 men, and Kane's job was to locate them and retrieve the stolen funds. He tracked 3 of the 4 thieves to Del Rio, where a confrontation occurred. The result left 2 of the men wounded and in custody, while the 3rd managed to escape during the confusion. More significantly, the recovered money was substantially less than what had been stolen, suggesting that the 4th member of the group, the one who had never been in Del Rio, still had the majority of the stolen funds. Kane's contract with the freight company specified recovery of the full amount, and his professional reputation depended on completing jobs as agreed. More personally, the escaped thief had made threats during the confrontation, specifically mentioning that Kane would regret his involvement. For both professional and personal reasons, Kane needed to find this 4th man. The process of tracking someone across the vast expanses of 1880s Texas was challenging, but not impossible for someone with Kane's resources and connections. He gathered information from multiple sources: bartenders who remembered conversations, stable workers who recalled distinctive horses, merchants who noted unusual purchases, and the informal network of informants that existed throughout the frontier. Piece by piece, he assembled a trail. That trail led to Dry Creek. Multiple sources indicated that a man matching the description of the 4th thief, going by the name Jack Marlowe, though that was almost certainly an alias, had been seen in Dry Creek approximately 6 weeks earlier. More recent information suggested he might still be in the area, possibly working at one of the surrounding ranches under yet another assumed name. Kane's plan, as he later described it to the territorial authorities, was straightforward. He would arrive in Dry Creek quietly, ask discreet questions, locate Marlowe, and either convince him to return the stolen money peacefully or, failing that, bring him to the nearest marshal's office to face charges. It was the kind of task Kane had performed dozens of times before, routine work that his reputation and experience made relatively uncomplicated. What Kane could not have anticipated was that his arrival in Dry Creek, even conducted quietly, would not go unnoticed. In a small town where everyone knew everyone, a stranger drew attention, and a stranger with Amos Kane's distinctive appearance, tall, lean, weather-worn, carrying himself with the unmistakable bearing of an experienced gunfighter, would draw even more. He arrived in the early evening as the spring sun was beginning to lower toward the horizon. The timing was deliberate. Evening was when working men returned to town, when saloons began to fill, and when the kind of casual conversations that yielded information occurred naturally. Kane stabled his horse at the livery, paid for feed and care, and declined the stable worker's offer of conversation with a polite nod. He then walked toward the town's single saloon, intending to order a meal and begin his quiet inquiries. He never made it inside. Amos Kane was approximately 50 yards from the saloon entrance, walking along the wooden boardwalk that fronted the main street buildings, when he encountered the child who would change everything. The boy appeared suddenly from between 2 buildings, not running or playing, but walking with the kind of purposeful determination that children sometimes display when they have decided to do something brave. He was perhaps 8 or 9 years old, though small for his age, wearing clothes that were clean but well worn and mended in several places. His hair was dark and slightly too long, falling across his forehead. Most striking were his eyes, large, bright, and completely without the wariness or fear that most children showed around adult strangers, particularly dangerous-looking ones. The boy walked directly into Kane's path and stopped, looking up at him with an expression of open curiosity. For a moment, they simply regarded each other, the legendary gunfighter and the fearless child, an encounter that must have seemed surreal to any observers. Kane's first instinct, conditioned by years of vigilance, was to scan the surroundings for threats. Was this child bait for an ambush? Were armed men waiting in the shadows? But a quick assessment revealed nothing suspicious, just ordinary townspeople going about their evening business, most now watching the interaction with varying degrees of interest. The boy spoke first. His voice was clear and confident, without the hesitation or shyness typical of children addressing adult strangers. "Are you a cowboy?" the child asked. Kane, taken somewhat off guard by the directness of the question, responded carefully, "I've worked cattle before." "But that's not what you are now," the boy said, not as a question but as a statement of observation. "You're something else." There was an uncomfortable perceptiveness in those words. Kane felt the attention of the watching townspeople, knew that how he handled this moment would affect his ability to work quietly in Dry Creek. He could not simply brush past a child. Such behavior would mark him immediately as cold or threatening, closing doors before he had a chance to ask his questions. "What do you think I am?" Kane asked, his tone neutral. The boy studied him with that unsettling directness. "I think you're a hero," he said finally. "Like in the stories, the ones who come to town and help people." Kane felt something tighten in his chest, an emotion he could not immediately identify. He was accustomed to being recognized, to seeing fear or calculation or respect in people's eyes. But this child looked at him with something entirely different, admiration mixed with hope, the innocent belief that the impressive stranger must surely be a force for good. "Stories aren't always true," Kane said carefully, choosing his words. "And heroes are complicated. But you help people, don't you?" the boy pressed. "You protect them?" It was a question that cut closer than the child could possibly know. Yes, Kane had protected people, but he had also frightened them, fought them, and on occasions he tried not to dwell on, ended their lives when circumstances demanded it. His role was far more ambiguous than the simple categories of hero and villain that populated children's stories. Before Kane could formulate a response, the boy did something that would become the pivotal moment of this entire encounter, the instant that would be remembered and recounted for years afterward. The child straightened slightly as though coming to attention, and spoke with simple, earnest respect. "Sir." That single word, spoken with genuine regard by an innocent who saw something worthy of honor in Amos Kane, struck him with more force than any bullet ever had. What happened next has been described by multiple witnesses, and while their accounts vary in minor details, they agree on the essential facts. The consistency of these independent testimonies gives us confidence in reconstructing the event accurately. When the boy addressed Kane as "Sir," something visible happened to the gunfighter. Witnesses described his posture changing, a sudden rigidity, as though he had been struck. His right hand, which had been hanging relaxed near his holster in his habitual ready position, began to tremble. Several people reported that Kane's face, normally composed and unreadable, showed clear distress. His jaw clenched, his eyes closed briefly, his breathing became irregular. Then, to the astonishment of everyone watching, Kane's hand moved to his revolver, but not in a draw. Instead, his fingers fumbled at the holster as though the gun had become unbearably hot or heavy. The weapon, a Colt single-action army that had been Kane's constant companion for more than a decade, slipped from his loosened grip and fell to the wooden boardwalk with a heavy thud. The sound of the gun hitting wood seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. No one moved. The child looked confused but not frightened. Kane stood frozen, staring down at the weapon lying at his feet as though it were an object he had never seen before. One witness, a shopkeeper named Martha Hendricks who observed the scene from her store window, later described Kane's expression as a man seeing a ghost, but not a ghost that frightened him, a ghost that broke his heart. The moment stretched. Then Kane slowly, carefully bent down and retrieved his weapon. His hands were still shaking visibly as he holstered it. When he straightened and looked at the boy again, his eyes were noticeably moist, a detail that shocked observers who had only known Kane by reputation as someone incapable of such vulnerability. "What's your name?" Kane asked, his voice rough. "Thomas," the boy replied. "Thomas Walker, what's yours?" There was a pause. Kane seemed to be deciding something, weighing options. Finally he spoke. "Amos. Amos Kane." The name produced visible reactions among the watching townspeople. Several stepped back instinctively. Others exchanged worried glances. Everyone in Dry Creek might not have known every detail of Amos Kane's reputation, but they knew the name, knew what it represented. But Thomas Walker, with the innocence of childhood and the fearlessness of those too young to understand danger, simply smiled. "That's a good name," he said. Do you need help, Mr. Kane? You look sad. To understand why a single word from a child had such a profound effect on Amos Kane, we must examine what psychologists would later come to understand about trauma, memory, and emotional triggers. While the scientific language for these concepts did not exist in 1883, the phenomena themselves were very real. Kane had lost his own family during his youth. The specific details remained private, but evidence suggests he had a younger brother who did not survive the chaos of the Civil War era. More significantly, testimony that emerged much later revealed that Kane had briefly been married in his early 20s and that marriage had produced a son. Both wife and child had perished in a fever epidemic that swept through a frontier settlement in the late 1860s. These losses had occurred at a formative period in Kane's life, when he was still developing the emotional armor that would later define him. The grief had been profound, and Kane's response had been to bury those feelings deeply, to construct an identity that had no room for vulnerability or emotional connection. He became the gunfighter, the legend, the man who needed nothing and no one. But trauma that is buried rather than processed does not disappear. It remains, waiting for the right trigger to bring it surging back. For Kane, that trigger was encountering a child of approximately the age his own son would have been had he lived. A child who looked at him not with fear or calculation, but with trust and admiration. More specifically, it was being addressed with simple respect. Sir, a word his own child might have learned to say had life gone differently. The psychological term for what Kane experienced is emotional flooding, a sudden overwhelming wave of feeling that bypasses rational control and manifests in physical symptoms. His trembling hands, his inability to maintain his usual composure, and the involuntary dropping of his weapon were all manifestations of this psychological storm. What makes Kane's reaction particularly significant is that it broke through defenses that had stood firm for more than a decade. He had faced threats, violence, and danger countless times without losing his composure. But this child's innocence reached him in a way that danger never could, touching the part of himself he had tried to lock away, the part that grieved, that longed for connection, that remembered being human beyond simply being a gunfighter. The scene on the main street of Dry Creek did not last long, but its impact rippled through the small community immediately. As Kane struggled to regain his composure, various townspeople reacted according to their natures and their assessment of the situation. The town's unofficial law enforcement, a man named Samuel Porter, who served as both general store owner and ad hoc sheriff when needed, approached cautiously, his own weapon conspicuously visible but not drawn. Porter was no gunfighter, but he was responsible for community safety, and the presence of Amos Kane, regardless of the strange scene that had just played out, required acknowledgement. Mr. Kane, Porter said carefully, I don't believe we're expecting trouble in Dry Creek. It was phrased as a statement but functioned as a question. Kane, still visibly shaken but working to restore his usual control, understood the inquiry. I'm here on business, Kane replied, his voice steadier now. Tracking a man named Jack Marlowe. Theft and outstanding warrants. I intended to make quiet inquiries, nothing more. The mention of Marlowe produced knowing looks among several townspeople. Porter's expression shifted slightly, suggesting recognition of the name. Marlowe left town 3 days ago, a voice called from the small crowd that had gathered. The speaker was an older man, weathered and lean. Heard he was headed toward Eagle Pass near the border. Kane absorbed this information, nodding. If accurate, it meant his trail had gone cold again, that he would need to continue his pursuit elsewhere. But at that moment, he found it difficult to care about Jack Marlowe, about stolen money, about professional obligations. His attention kept returning to the child standing before him, still watching with those unnervingly trusting eyes. Thomas, Kane said, addressing the boy directly, where are your parents? For the first time, the child's confidence wavered slightly. My ma is at home. She's been sick. That's why I came into town, to get medicine from Mr. Porter's store. And your father? He passed, Thomas said simply, with the matter-of-fact tone children sometimes use for painful subjects they don't fully understand. 2 winters ago, accident with a horse. Kane felt that tightening in his chest again. A widow struggling with illness. A fatherless boy taking on responsibilities beyond his years, trying to be brave and helpful in a world that was often neither brave nor helpful. It was a common enough story on the frontier, where life was hard and death came easily. But coming in this moment from this particular child, it struck Kane deeply. "Mr. Porter," Kane said, turning to the storekeeper, "whatever medicine the boy needs, add it to my account. And add provisions. Enough for a week for a family of—" "How many, Thomas?" "Just me and Ma," Thomas replied, eyes widening at this unexpected generosity. "Enough for a week, then. Good quality." Porter nodded, and if he was surprised by this development, he had the sense not to show it. "I'll prepare it right away." Kane looked down at Thomas again. "You did a good thing coming to get medicine for your mother. That took courage. You should head home before it gets dark, but wait for the provisions first." "Will you stay in town, Mr. Kane?" Thomas asked. "Will I see you again?" It was a simple question, asked with the innocent hope of a child who thought he had found something special. Kane had no good answer. His professional trail had led elsewhere. His intention had been to stay only as long as necessary to gather information. Every instinct developed over years of frontier survival told him to move on, to not form attachments, to remember that connection meant vulnerability. But looking at this child, feeling the emotions that had been stirred from their long burial, Kane found himself unable to simply ride away. "I'll stay tonight," he said finally, "at the boarding house. We can talk tomorrow if your mother permits it." That night, in a modest room at Dry Creek's boarding house, Amos Kane experienced something he had not allowed himself in more than a decade: sustained introspection. He sat on the edge of a narrow bed, his gun belt hung carefully on a nearby chair, and confronted the feelings that meeting Thomas Walker had unleashed. The room was sparse: a bed, a small table, a chair, a washstand with a cracked basin. A single window looked out onto the darkened main street. Kane had stayed in hundreds of such rooms over the years, never thinking of them as more than temporary shelter. But tonight, the emptiness of the space seemed to reflect something internal, a hollowness he had successfully ignored until this evening. He thought about his son, allowed himself to think about his son for the first time in years. The boy had been barely 2 years old when the fever took him. Kane could still remember the weight of that small body in his arms, the trust in eyes that looked to him for protection he could not provide. He remembered the funeral, remembered walking away from that tiny grave and deciding, with the absolute certainty that comes from unbearable pain, that he would never allow himself to feel that vulnerable again. The gunfighter's life he had built afterward was perfectly designed for emotional safety. He formed no close relationships. He took no permanent responsibilities. He moved constantly, never staying long enough for connections to develop. His reputation served as a wall between himself and others. People feared him, respected him, or wanted to use him, but no one tried to know him. It was lonely, but loneliness was safer than loss. Thomas Walker had somehow breached all those defenses in a single moment, simply by looking at Kane with trust and calling him "Sir." The boy had seen something in him, something worthwhile, something honorable, that Kane himself had stopped believing existed. And that recognition, that gift of innocent faith, had cracked open doors Kane had sealed long ago. He knew the rational response: leave Dry Creek in the morning, return to tracking Jack Marlowe, complete the job he had been hired to do. Let this evening be a strange anomaly, a momentary weakness to be forgotten and never repeated. Return to the safety of emotional distance and professional focus. But Kane found himself unable to commit to that plan. Something fundamental had shifted. The armor he had built so carefully now felt less like protection and more like a prison. The life he had constructed seemed suddenly empty rather than simply solitary. For the first time in years, Amos Kane asked himself a question he had been avoiding. What was the point? What was he working toward? His reputation. That was secure but increasingly felt like a burden rather than an achievement. Money? He had enough saved to live comfortably if he chose. Purpose? Tracking down petty thieves and protecting freight shipments hardly seemed like meaningful purpose when examined honestly. He had no answers that night, only questions. But the fact that he was asking at all represented a significant change. The man who had ridden into Dry Creek that afternoon had been certain of who he was and what he did. The man sitting in this bare room, watching moonlight through a dusty window, was no longer certain of anything. While Kane wrestled with his internal turmoil, the town of Dry Creek was processing the evening's events in its own way. In the saloon, in homes, in quiet conversations on porches and in yards, people discussed what they had witnessed and what it might mean. The presence of Amos Kane in their town was significant in itself. Most of Dry Creek's residents had never encountered anyone of his reputation. To them, he was a figure from stories, from newspaper accounts, from the mythologized West that existed in dime novels and campfire tales. That such a person would appear in their modest settlement was remarkable. But what they had witnessed was even more remarkable. The legendary gunfighter, reportedly the fastest and deadliest shooter in Texas, had been visibly affected, shaken even, by an encounter with a child. His weapon had fallen from his hand not because of superior force or clever trickery, but because of a simple word spoken in innocence. The interpretations varied. Some saw it as evidence that even the hardest men had weaknesses, vulnerabilities that could be exploited. This view was held primarily by those of a cynical or predatory nature, who immediately began calculating how this information might be useful. Others interpreted it as a sign of Kane's humanity, evidence that beneath the fearsome reputation was someone capable of feeling, of being moved. This view was more common among the town's families, particularly mothers who understood the power of a child's innocence. Still others worried about what this meant for Dry Creek's immediate safety. If Kane was compromised, if his legendary composure was cracked, might he be more dangerous? Or conversely, might his vulnerability attract threats, other gunfighters seeking to make their reputations, enemies who would see an opportunity? Samuel Porter, the practical storekeeper who served as unofficial town leadership, had concerns of a different nature. He worried about young Thomas Walker and his mother Sarah. They were decent people struggling with the common hardships of frontier life. Porter feared that becoming entangled with someone like Amos Kane, regardless of the man's intentions, could bring them trouble they were ill-equipped to handle. That evening, Porter visited the Walker home himself, carrying the medicine and provisions Kane had purchased. He found Sarah Walker in bed, weak from illness but conscious. He explained what had happened in town, describing the encounter between Kane and her son. Sarah's reaction was measured. She thanked Porter for the supplies and for his concern. When he expressed worry about Thomas's interaction with a dangerous man, she responded with a perspective that surprised him. "Thomas lost his father 2 years ago," Sarah said quietly. "He tries to be brave, tries to be the man of our little family, but he's still a boy. He needs to see that men can be good. That strength doesn't have to mean cruelty. If Mr. Kane showed him any kindness, even just for a moment, I'm grateful for that." Porter left the Walker home unsure whether Sarah was wise or naive. The frontier made people hard out of necessity, but it could also make them desperate for any glimpse of goodness. He hoped, for the sake of both mother and child, that Amos Kane would move on quickly and without incident. But in his heart, Porter suspected that the gunfighter's unexpected vulnerability might lead to complications no one could yet predict. When dawn broke over Dry Creek the following morning, Amos Kane rose from a largely sleepless night, having made a decision that surprised even himself. He would not immediately resume tracking Jack Marlowe. He would stay in Dry Creek for at least a few days, though he could not have clearly articulated why this seemed necessary. Part of his reasoning was practical. He had paid for medicine and provisions for the Walker family, and he felt a responsibility to ensure they received proper help. Sarah Walker was ill, and an 8-year-old boy should not be shouldering adult responsibilities alone. Kane could spare a few days to ensure they had what they needed, but this practical justification was, he knew, only partially true. The deeper reason was that walking away from Thomas Walker immediately felt impossible in a way that Kane could not fully explain. The child had stirred something in him that demanded attention, that refused to be ignored or buried again. Kane sensed that this encounter was significant, that it represented something important, though he could not yet say what. After dressing and checking his equipment, habits so ingrained they occurred almost automatically, Kane left the boarding house and walked toward the general store. The morning air was cool and fresh, the street mostly empty at this early hour. A few early risers nodded warily at him as he passed. His reputation preceded him, and people remained uncertain about what his presence in their town meant. At the general store, he found Samuel Porter already at work, preparing for the day's business. The storekeeper looked up as Kane entered, his expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Kane," Porter greeted him formally. "How can I help you this morning?" "The provisions I ordered last night for the Walker family," Kane said. "Has someone delivered them?" "I was planning to take them out myself this morning," Porter replied. "The Walker place is about 2 miles east of town. Small homestead. Sarah Walker keeps to herself mostly, especially since her husband passed." Kane nodded. "I'd like to deliver them myself if that's acceptable, along with offering my assistance if they need anything else." Porter studied him carefully, clearly trying to assess Kane's intentions. Finally, he spoke with careful diplomacy. "Mr. Kane, I don't doubt your sincerity, but I feel obligated to point out that involving yourself with that family could bring them unwanted attention. Your reputation, deserved or not, carries consequences for those associated with you." "I'm aware," Kane said quietly, "but that boy showed me kindness yesterday. More than that, he showed me respect I'm not certain I've earned. I need to repay that. Not with money, though I have that. With time and attention, if they'll accept it." It was perhaps the most honest thing Kane had said to anyone in years. Porter seemed to recognize this, and his expression softened slightly. "All right," he said. "I'll load the provisions onto a wagon. You can take it out there yourself. But Mr. Kane, be careful with them. They've had enough hardship." "I will," Kane promised. As Amos Kane prepared to drive a loaded wagon out to a struggling homestead to help a widow and her son, he was crossing a bridge between two different versions of his life. Behind him lay years of carefully maintained emotional distance, of reputation management, of being the legendary gunfighter rather than simply a man. Ahead lay uncertainty, connection, vulnerability, and the possibility of being hurt again. The encounter in Dry Creek had been brief, lasting only minutes from the moment Thomas Walker stepped into Kane's path to the moment Kane agreed to stay at the boarding house. But those minutes had fractured something that Kane had believed was unbreakable. His certainty about who he was and how he needed to live. A single word, "Sir," spoken with innocent respect by a child who saw potential goodness in a man known primarily for his skill at violence. That word had disarmed Amos Kane more completely than any opponent ever had, reaching past his defenses to touch something he had tried to bury, his own humanity. As he drove the wagon out of Dry Creek toward the Walker homestead, following Porter's directions along a rutted trail, Kane understood that he was not just delivering supplies. He was testing something, exploring a possibility. Could he be more than his reputation? Could he form connections without the pain of inevitable loss destroying him? Could the most feared shooter in Texas become something else? Perhaps something better? He had no answers yet, but for the first time in more than a decade, he was willing to ask the questions. And that willingness, born from a moment of unexpected grace on a dusty street, was already changing everything. The sun climbed higher as Kane drove eastward. Behind him, Dry Creek went about its morning business. Ahead, at a small homestead he had never seen, a widow and her son waited, unknowing, for the arrival of a legendary gunfighter who was beginning to discover that legends, powerful as they might be, were sometimes prisons that needed escaping. The story of how Amos Kane would navigate this transformation, and what it would cost him, was just beginning. The encounter that disarmed him was complete. What came next would determine whether that disarmament was a momentary weakness or the beginning of genuine change. The human mind has remarkable capacities for both remembering and forgetting. We preserve memories we wish to keep and bury those that cause us pain. But buried memories do not truly disappear. They remain beneath the surface, shaping our choices and reactions in ways we often fail to recognize. For Amos Kane, the encounter with Thomas Walker had cracked open a carefully sealed vault of memories, releasing ghosts he had spent more than a decade trying to escape. This chapter explores the hidden history of Amos Kane, the experiences that shaped him before he became a legend, the losses that drove him to build walls around his heart, and the psychological mechanisms he employed to survive his own grief. We will examine how trauma transforms individuals, particularly in the context of the harsh and unforgiving American frontier, where survival often demanded emotional suppression, and where showing vulnerability could be dangerous. We will also investigate the mysterious connection between Kane and young Thomas Walker. Why did this particular child affect Kane so profoundly? Was it merely that Thomas reminded Kane of his own lost son? Or was there something more? And as Kane begins to confront his buried past, what dangers emerge, both from within his own psyche and from external forces that see his vulnerability as an opportunity. The past, as Kane is about to discover, never stays buried forever, and when it resurfaces, it demands acknowledgement, resolution, and often a price. To understand the man Amos Kane became, we must first understand the boy he was. The fragmentary records that survive, combined with accounts from those who knew him in his youth, paint a picture of a childhood marked by instability and early loss. Amos was born in 1848 in central Missouri, a border state that would become a battleground during the Civil War. His father, Robert Kane, worked as a blacksmith and occasional farmer, skills that provided a modest but adequate living. His mother, Elizabeth, managed the household, and according to later accounts, possessed a gentle nature and strong faith that provided stability for her family. Amos had one sibling, a younger brother named Samuel, born in 1851. The two boys were close, as siblings often are when they have few other companions in isolated rural settings. Samuel was described by those who remembered him as cheerful and curious, qualities that contrasted with Amos's more serious and observant nature. The Kane family's life, while not prosperous, was stable until the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861. Missouri's position as a border state created particular chaos. The state officially remained in the Union, but Confederate sympathies were strong in many areas, and irregular warfare between various factions made civilian life extremely dangerous. Robert Kane, like many men of his generation and location, faced impossible choices about where his loyalties lay. The historical record does not clearly indicate which side, if any, he supported. What is documented is that in the summer of 1863, when Amos was 15 and Samuel was 12, their father was taken from their home by a group of armed men. Whether Union soldiers, Confederate irregulars, or simple bandits taking advantage of wartime chaos remains unclear. Robert Kane never returned. Whether he was pressed into service, imprisoned, or met a more final fate, his family never learned with certainty. This ambiguity, this not knowing, was in some ways worse than confirmed loss. It left Elizabeth Kane in an impossible position, a widow who could not truly claim that status, unable to grieve openly or move forward with certainty. The family's circumstances deteriorated rapidly. Without Robert's income, and with the general chaos of the war disrupting normal commerce, Elizabeth struggled to provide for her two sons. They moved several times, staying with relatives or in temporary housing, constantly on the edge of genuine deprivation. It was during this period that Amos first demonstrated the characteristics that would later define him. At an age when most boys his age were still dependent on adults, he took on responsibilities far beyond his years. He found work where he could, helping with harvests, tending animals, doing odd jobs in exchange for food or small amounts of money. He became fiercely protective of his mother and brother, developing a wariness and vigilance that would never entirely leave him. He also learned to shoot. Firearms were necessary tools on the frontier, but for Amos, they became something more. He discovered that he had an exceptional natural aptitude, steady hands, excellent eyesight, and an ability to remain calm under pressure. Practicing with an old rifle and later with a borrowed pistol, he developed skills that brought him a measure of respect and, occasionally, paid work protecting property or livestock. But the relative stability this provided was temporary. In the winter of 1865, shortly after the war's end, tragedy struck again. An outbreak of disease, possibly typhoid or cholera, the records are unclear, swept through the temporary settlement where the Kane family was living. Samuel contracted the illness and, despite his mother's devoted care and Amos's desperate efforts to find medical help, passed away within a week. The loss of Samuel devastated what remained of the Kane family. Elizabeth's health, already compromised by years of hardship and inadequate nutrition, declined rapidly. She survived her younger son by less than 6 months, passing away in the summer of 1865. At 17 years old, Amos Kane found himself completely alone. He had lost his father to war, his brother to disease, and his mother to a combination of illness and perhaps a broken heart. These losses occurred during the crucial developmental period when a young man forms his understanding of the world, relationships, and his place in both. The psychological impact of such concentrated loss during adolescence cannot be overstated. Modern psychology understands that trauma during these formative years fundamentally shapes personality development, attachment styles, and emotional regulation. For Amos Kane, the lesson learned was clear and brutal. Connection means pain, loss is inevitable, and the only reliable person is oneself. After his mother's passing, Amos Kane drifted westward, as countless young men did in the years following the Civil War. He worked various jobs: cowhand, freight guard, occasional lawman, gradually building both his skills and his reputation. By his early 20s, he was known in several territories as someone reliable, skilled with weapons, and not to be trifled with. It was in San Antonio, Texas, in 1870 that Amos met Catherine Morrison. She was the daughter of a merchant, educated by frontier standards, and possessed of both intelligence and independence. What drew Kane to her, a man who had trained himself to avoid emotional connection, remains somewhat mysterious, but contemporary accounts suggest that Catherine saw past his defensive walls to something worth knowing. Their courtship was brief, and they married in the spring of 1871. For a time, Kane attempted to build a normal life. He took steady work as a security guard for freight companies, earned regular income, and tried to be the kind of husband and partner that Catherine deserved. By all accounts, Catherine understood who she had married, understood his past, his losses, and the emotional barriers he struggled with, and loved him regardless. In late 1871, Catherine gave birth to a son. They named him Samuel, after Amos's lost brother. The arrival of this child represented something profound for Kane, a chance to build the family he had lost, to protect someone as he had been unable to protect his brother, to perhaps heal some of the old wounds through creating something new. Contemporary accounts, while sparse, suggest that fatherhood affected Kane deeply. Friends reported seeing a softness in him that had not been present before, a willingness to hope and plan for the future. He spoke of eventually purchasing land, of building something permanent, of giving his son opportunities he himself had never had. But the frontier was unforgiving of such hopes. In the summer of 1873, when Samuel was not quite 2 years old, a fever epidemic swept through the region where the Kane family lived. The illness struck with terrifying speed, and frontier medicine had no effective treatments. Both Catherine and young Samuel contracted the fever. Despite Amos's frantic efforts to get medical help, to find someone who could offer treatment or hope, they both succumbed within days of each other. The loss was catastrophic. In the span of 1 week, Amos Kane lost his entire world, his wife, his son, and all the hope he had allowed himself to feel. He had opened himself to connection, had permitted himself to believe in the possibility of happiness, and had been punished for it in the most brutal way imaginable. The funeral was small and quick, as frontier funerals often were. Kane buried his wife and son in a modest cemetery, marked their graves with simple wooden crosses, and walked away. Those who saw him in the days immediately following reported a man who seemed hollowed out, functioning through pure mechanical habit but showing no emotion at all. Within a month, Kane had transformed his life completely. He abandoned any pretense of normal domestic existence, sold what few possessions he had accumulated, and reinvented himself as a gunfighter and hired protector. The skills he had developed over the years became his entire identity. He became Amos Kane, the legend. Amos Kane, the fastest gun in Texas. Amos Kane who needed nothing and no one. What he actually became was Amos Kane running from unbearable pain, constructing an entire life designed to ensure he would never feel that vulnerable again. The transformation of Amos Kane from a grieving widower to a legendary gunfighter was not instantaneous, but it was deliberate. In the months and years following the loss of his family, Kane systematically built both his skills and his reputation, creating an identity that protected him from further emotional injury. From a psychological perspective, Kane's response to trauma was not unusual for his time and place. The frontier offered limited outlets for processing grief. There were no counselors, no support groups, no therapeutic interventions. Men in particular were expected to endure hardship stoically, to move on without dwelling on loss. Showing vulnerability was often seen as weakness, and weakness could be dangerous in an environment where projecting strength was essential for survival. Kane's solution was to become someone for whom normal human vulnerabilities did not apply. He trained obsessively, practicing his draw and aim thousands of times until the movements were completely automatic. He studied confrontation tactics, learning to read body language and anticipate violence before it occurred. He cultivated emotional detachment, training himself to remain calm and calculating in situations that would overwhelm others with fear or anger. Most importantly, he avoided any situation or relationship that might create emotional connection. He never stayed in one place long enough to form friendships. He avoided romantic entanglements entirely. He took no apprentices, formed no partnerships, and maintained only the most superficial professional relationships. He became, by design, completely alone. This isolation served a protective function. If he cared for no one, and no one truly knew him, then he could not be hurt by loss. The strategy was psychologically effective in the short term. It allowed him to function, to build his reputation, to achieve professional success, but it came at an enormous cost to his humanity and his capacity for fulfillment. The historical record shows numerous instances where Kane's emotional detachment was evident. He completed jobs efficiently but showed no particular satisfaction in success. He accumulated money but spent it minimally and without pleasure. He was respected and feared but had no actual friends. Multiple accounts describe him as courteous but distant, professional but cold, present but somehow absent. What Kane had created was not truly a life, but rather an elaborate defensive structure designed to prevent living. He existed in a state of suspended animation, going through necessary motions but never truly engaging with the world or with other people. He was, in effect, a ghost, present but not truly there, going through the familiar patterns of existence without experiencing their substance. This defensive structure served him well for more than a decade. It protected him from further loss by ensuring there was nothing left to lose, but it also trapped him in a kind of emotional prison, cutting him off from the full range of human experience and leaving him isolated in ways that even he did not fully recognize until Thomas Walker appeared. The profound effect that Thomas Walker had on Amos Kane demands explanation. While it is clear that the boy reminded Kane of his lost son, there were deeper currents at work in their encounter, factors that Kane himself was only beginning to understand as he spent more time in Dry Creek. Thomas Walker was, by all accounts, a remarkable child. Despite living in difficult circumstances, a widowed mother struggling with illness, limited resources, and the general hardships of frontier life, Thomas maintained an optimism and courage that impressed everyone who knew him. He took on responsibilities that would challenge many adults, caring for his mother, managing their small homestead, and conducting necessary business in town without complaint or self-pity. More unusually, Thomas possessed an ability to see good in people that most children his age lacked. Where other children in Dry Creek had learned to be wary of strangers, particularly dangerous-looking strangers, Thomas approached the world with an openness and trust that seemed almost naive, but was actually grounded in a sophisticated moral intuition. He could sense character beneath surface appearances, could perceive potential goodness, even in those who had spent years hiding it. This quality was what had led Thomas to approach Amos Kane without fear. Where others saw a legendary gunfighter to be feared or respected from a distance, Thomas saw someone who might be interesting, who might be worth knowing. His decision to call Kane Sir was not a calculated strategy, but an instinctive recognition that this man, despite his fearsome reputation, deserved basic respect and human acknowledgement. As Kane spent more time near the Walker homestead in the days following their first meeting, he learned more about Thomas's background. The boy's father, Michael Walker, had been a good man by all accounts, hard-working, devoted to his family, respected in the community. His accidental passing 2 years earlier had left Sarah Walker to manage their homestead alone, a nearly impossible task even in the best circumstances. Thomas had stepped into the gap his father left, trying to be the man of the family at an age when he should still have been simply a child. He did this not with resentment, but with a quiet determination that reminded Kane painfully of his own adolescence, when circumstances had forced him to grow up far too quickly. But there was something more that Kane sensed, but could not quite articulate. Thomas looked at him with an expectation of goodness that Kane had not experienced in years, perhaps ever. The boy seemed to believe that Kane was or could be a hero, not in the flashy, dramatic sense of dime novel stories, but in the quieter, more meaningful sense of someone who used their strength to help rather than harm, to protect rather than threaten. This belief, this faith in his potential goodness, challenged everything Kane had constructed about himself. He had spent years building an identity as someone dangerous, someone to be feared, someone who operated outside normal human connection. But Thomas refused to see him that way, insisted through his actions and attitudes on perceiving the human being beneath the legend. Kane found this both uncomfortable and strangely compelling. Part of him wanted to correct Thomas's perception, to explain that he was not a hero, and never had been, that his life was built on violence, and that good people maintained their distance from him. But another part, a part he had thought completely buried, responded to Thomas's faith with a desperate hunger to deserve it, to perhaps become the person this child believed him to be. While Amos Kane was navigating the emotional complexities of his unexpected connection with the Walker family, his presence in Dry Creek and his visible vulnerability had not gone unnoticed by those with less benevolent intentions. News of what had happened on Dry Creek's main street, the legendary gunfighter visibly shaken, his weapon falling from his hand, had spread quickly through the informal networks that connected frontier towns. In saloons, on cattle trails, and in the darker corners of border settlements, men heard the story and began calculating what it might mean. Among those who heard with particular interest was a man named Cole Hastings. Hastings had a long-standing grudge against Amos Kane, dating back to an incident 5 years earlier, when Kane had interfered with Hastings' attempt to extort money from a freight company. The confrontation had ended with Hastings backing down without drawing his weapon, publicly humiliated, and forced to leave the territory. The shame of that encounter had festered for years, and Hastings had waited for an opportunity to restore his reputation. The news from Dry Creek suggested that opportunity had finally arrived. If Kane was compromised, if his legendary composure had cracked, then perhaps he could be challenged successfully. Hastings began making plans to travel to Dry Creek, gathering a small group of similarly disposed men who saw Kane's vulnerability as a chance to make their own reputations. But Hastings was not the only one interested. Jack Marlowe, the thief Kane had been tracking when he arrived in Dry Creek, had not actually left the area as reported. Instead, Marlowe had been hiding at a ranch 20 miles from town, waiting for Kane to move on. When his informants told him that Kane had stayed in Dry Creek and seemed oddly distracted, Marlowe sensed an opportunity to eliminate the threat Kane represented permanently. There were others as well, bounty hunters who saw a potentially vulnerable target, rivals who wanted to test themselves against the legend, and simple opportunists who thought that a distracted Amos Kane might be easier to rob or ambush than the vigilant professional he had always been. Kane himself was aware of these dangers on some level. Years of survival on the frontier had given him finely tuned instincts for threat assessment. He knew that showing weakness, even briefly, created opportunities for his enemies. He knew that his unusual behavior in Dry Creek would be noticed and discussed, that predators would be attracted to any perceived vulnerability. But for the first time in more than a decade, Kane found himself caring about something more than his own survival or reputation. His concern for Thomas and Sarah Walker, his desire to perhaps be the kind of person Thomas believed he could be, competed with his professional awareness of danger. He faced a choice: prioritize his own safety by leaving Dry Creek immediately and returning to his familiar defensive patterns, or stay and accept the increased risk that came with genuine human connection. The choice was complicated by another factor. Kane was not at his psychological peak. The encounter with Thomas had cracked open emotional wounds that had never properly healed. He was sleeping poorly, troubled by dreams of his lost son and wife. His usually perfect emotional control was inconsistent. His hands, which had always been rock steady, occasionally trembled when he thought about things too deeply. In short, at the moment when danger was most likely to arrive, Amos Kane was genuinely compromised in ways that went beyond mere rumor. He was, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, genuinely vulnerable. The most significant struggle Amos Kane faced during this period was not external, but internal. As he spent time helping the Walker family, repairing their fence, ensuring they had adequate supplies, teaching Thomas basic skills for managing their homestead, Kane found himself in a constant state of internal conflict between the life he had built and the life he was beginning to imagine might be possible. The gunfighter identity he had constructed was totalizing and demanding. It required constant vigilance, emotional detachment, and absolute prioritization of survival and reputation. It left no room for vulnerability, connection, or the kinds of ordinary human joys that came from helping others without expectation of payment or reputation enhancement. But being with Thomas and Sarah Walker was showing Kane a different possibility. Sarah, once she recovered enough from her illness to properly meet him, treated him with careful courtesy, but also with an assumption of basic goodness that Kane found both uncomfortable and moving. She thanked him for his help, but also spoke to him as a person, rather than as a legend or a threat. She asked about his preferences for meals when he visited, inquired about his comfort, treated him as a human being deserving of ordinary social consideration. Thomas, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly attached to Kane. The boy followed him around the homestead when Kane came to help, asking questions about everything from how to properly mend a fence to what Kane had seen in his travels. Thomas's admiration was evident, but also his need, the need for a male role model, for guidance, for someone who could teach him the skills and perspectives his deceased father would have provided. Kane found himself responding to these needs despite all his training and defensive instincts. He discovered that he enjoyed teaching Thomas, took satisfaction in seeing the boy's skills develop. He found himself looking forward to the simple meals Sarah prepared, to the ordinary conversations about weather and crops and town news. He began to experience something he had thought permanently lost, a sense of belonging, of being part of something beyond his solitary professional existence. But this emerging connection terrified him. Every moment of enjoyment was shadowed by the memory of previous loss. Every instance of caring about Thomas's well-being brought back the agony of losing his own son. Every moment of comfort in Sarah's home reminded him of the domestic peace he had briefly known with Catherine before fever took her. The internal battle manifested in physical symptoms. Kane experienced tension headaches, difficulty sleeping, and occasional moments of what we would now recognize as anxiety attacks, sudden overwhelming feelings of dread or panic that he struggled to control. His usual perfect emotional regulation was inconsistent, and he sometimes found himself near tears for no reason he could identify. He also struggled with profound questions of identity. If he was not the detached legendary gunfighter, then who was he? Could he truly change, or would he inevitably revert to his defensive patterns? Did he have the right to involve himself in Thomas and Sarah's lives when his presence might bring them danger? Was he capable of being the kind of person who deserved their trust and affection? These were questions Kane had no framework for answering. The frontier did not encourage introspection or psychological sophistication. He had no one to talk to about his internal conflicts, no guide for navigating this territory. He was, in many ways, as lost as he had been at 17 when his mother died, but now with decades of defensive habits that made genuine change even more difficult. As the days passed with Kane remaining in Dry Creek, 3 separate storylines were converging toward an inevitable confrontation. First, Kane's internal struggle between his defended past and his potential future was reaching a crisis point. He would need to make a choice about who he wanted to be, and that choice would have permanent consequences. Second, the practical dangers he had sensed were materializing. Cole Hastings and his group were confirmed to be traveling toward Dry Creek, approximately 3 days away. Jack Marlowe, still hiding in the vicinity, was making plans of his own. The convergence of these threats meant that violence was likely imminent. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Thomas Walker had awakened in Kane not just memories, but also the ghosts of possibility, the husband and father he might have been, the ordinary human life he might have lived if circumstances had been different. These ghosts were demanding acknowledgement, forcing Kane to confront not just what he had lost, but what he had chosen to abandon in his response to that loss. The ghosts of Amos Kane's past were no longer buried safely beneath his gunfighter legend. They were present, active, and demanding resolution. Whether that resolution would lead to healing or to further tragedy remained to be seen. But Kane understood, with increasing clarity, that he could no longer exist in the suspended state he had maintained for over a decade. Change was coming, whether he chose it or not. The only question was whether he would face it as the legend he had built, distant, defended, and ultimately alone, or as the human being Thomas Walker had seen beneath that legend, flawed, vulnerable, but capable of genuine connection and growth. The final confrontation was approaching, and it would test not just Kane's legendary skills, but something far more fundamental: his capacity to choose hope over fear, connection over isolation, and life over mere survival. The fourth and final chapter of Amos Kane's story brings us to a moment of inevitable confrontation, not just with external enemies, but with the fundamental question of identity and purpose. After years of living as a legend, Kane now faced a choice that no amount of skill with a firearm could resolve for him. Would he remain the isolated gunfighter he had constructed himself to be, or would he risk becoming something more human, more vulnerable, and ultimately more alive? This chapter examines how Kane navigated the convergence of threats, relationships, and internal conflicts that had been building since his arrival in Dry Creek. We will explore the nature of courage, not the courage to face armed opponents, which Kane had demonstrated countless times, but the far more difficult courage to open oneself to connection, despite the certainty of eventual loss. We will witness how a man known for his decisiveness in confrontation struggled with decisions about the heart, and how a community watched as legend transformed into something more complicated and more real. Most importantly, we will see how the presence of one innocent child created ripples that extended far beyond a single moment on a dusty street, ultimately challenging not just one man, but an entire way of understanding strength, masculinity, and what it means to live with purpose in an unforgiving world. 3 days after Kane's initial encounter with Thomas Walker, information reached Dry Creek that confirmed what Kane had suspected. Cole Hastings and 3 companions were traveling toward the town with clear hostile intent. The news came through a cattle driver who had encountered Hastings's group at a way station 20 miles distant, where Hastings had made no secret of his purpose. Samuel Porter brought this information to Kane directly, finding him at the Walker homestead, where he had been helping repair a damaged section of the barn roof. Porter's expression was grave as he delivered the news. "Mr. Kane, I thought you should know. Cole Hastings is coming. He's been telling anyone who listened that he means to settle accounts with you." Kane climbed down from the roof carefully, wiping sweat from his forehead. Thomas stood nearby, watching with the attentive concern of someone who sensed the seriousness of the conversation, even if he didn't fully understand it. "How many with him?" Kane asked. 3 others. The driver said they're well armed and that Hastings has been drinking, working himself up for courage. Kane nodded, his expression thoughtful rather than concerned. "When will they arrive?" "Tomorrow, most likely. Midday or afternoon." Porter paused. "Mr. Kane, no one in Dry Creek wants trouble. If you were to leave tonight, head in another direction, Hastings would likely follow rather than cause problems here." It was a reasonable suggestion, and Kane recognized it as such. Leaving would protect the town from potential violence, would maintain his established pattern of avoiding unnecessary complications. It was exactly what the Amos Kane of 2 weeks ago would have done without hesitation. But Kane found himself looking at Thomas, who was trying to appear brave but whose eyes showed worry. He thought of Sarah Walker, still recovering her strength, who had begun to smile more easily in recent days. He thought of the simple satisfaction he had found in honest work, in being helpful rather than merely formidable. "I appreciate the suggestion, Mr. Porter," Kane said carefully, "but I think I'll stay. Hastings has been nursing this grudge for 5 years. If I run now, he'll just follow, and the confrontation will happen somewhere else, possibly involving other innocent people. Better to settle it here, where I can control the circumstances." Porter sighed but nodded. "I expected you'd say something like that. Is there anything the town can do to help? Keep people off the main street tomorrow afternoon. Make sure everyone knows to stay inside. This shouldn't take long, and the fewer witnesses, the better." After Porter left, Thomas approached Kane hesitantly. "Mr. Kane, are you going to have to fight?" Kane knelt down to the boy's eye level, something he found himself doing increasingly often. "Sometimes, Thomas, men make choices that lead to conflict. Mr. Hastings made those choices a long time ago, and now he's coming here because of them. I'd prefer to resolve this peacefully, but I need to be prepared for other possibilities. Will you be all right?" The worry in Thomas's voice was unmistakable. "I've handled situations like this before," Kane said gently. "Many times. You don't need to worry about me. But you're different now." Thomas said with the unsettling perceptiveness children sometimes display. "You're not as hard as you were when you first came here. Ma says you seem more alive but also more worried. Does that make you less safe?" It was an astute observation. Kane was indeed different, more emotionally present, more connected, and therefore more vulnerable. Whether that made him less effective in confrontation was a question he had been pondering himself. "Different doesn't necessarily mean weaker," Kane said, hoping it was true. "Sometimes it means having more reasons to be careful, more reasons to do things right. That can make a person more focused, not less." Thomas seemed somewhat reassured, though not entirely. As Kane returned to his work on the barn, he reflected on the boy's question. Was he compromised? Had his emotional opening made him less capable? Or had it perhaps given him something he had lacked for years, a reason to survive beyond mere habit? The following afternoon arrived with clear skies and mounting tension. True to Samuel Porter's warning, the townspeople of Dry Creek stayed largely indoors, watching from windows as the main street emptied. Kane had positioned himself deliberately, standing in the center of the street with a clear line of sight in all directions. He had sent Thomas and Sarah Walker a message through Porter, asking them to remain at their homestead regardless of what they heard. He did not want the boy anywhere near what was about to occur. Sarah had reluctantly agreed, though she sent back a message expressing concern for Kane's safety that touched him more deeply than he expected. Cole Hastings and his 3 companions arrived exactly when predicted, riding into town from the western approach shortly after noon. Hastings himself was a large man, thick through the shoulders and chest, with a face marked by years of hard living and harder attitudes. His companions were younger, clearly hired for their willingness to use violence rather than for any particular skill. They stopped their horses approximately 50 yards from where Kane stood. Hastings dismounted slowly, deliberately, playing to an audience even though the street appeared empty. His companions remained mounted, spreading out slightly to cover different angles. "Amos Kane," Hastings called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Been a long time. 5 years," Kane acknowledged. "You've traveled a long way, Hastings. Was it really necessary?" "You made me look like a coward," Hastings said, his voice rising with old anger. "Shamed me in front of people. I've been waiting for a chance to settle that debt." Kane kept his voice calm and level. "You walked away alive and unharmed. Most men would consider that a favorable outcome. There's no debt here except the one you've created in your own mind." "Then let's settle what's in my mind," Hastings snarled. "I hear you've gone soft, Kane. Hear you dropped your gun in front of a kid, that you've been playing house with some widow. That true?" Kane felt a flash of anger at the mention of Sarah and Thomas, but he controlled it carefully. "My personal business isn't your concern. You came here for a confrontation. Let's keep it between us and leave everyone else out of it." "Maybe I want to make it my concern," Hastings said, his hand moving toward his holster. "Maybe I want to visit that widow after I'm done with you. Show her what a real man—" He never finished the sentence. Kane's draw was instantaneous, his weapon clearing leather and firing in a single fluid motion that witnesses later described as almost invisible in its speed. The shot struck Hastings's gun hand just as his fingers closed on his weapon, the impact spinning the gun away and sending Hastings staggering backward with a cry of pain. The 3 mounted companions reacted immediately, reaching for their own weapons. But Kane's gun was already tracking to them, and his voice cut through their movements with absolute authority. "Don't." The single word carried such certainty that all 3 men froze. "Your employer came here for personal reasons that have nothing to do with you. He's been hurt but not seriously. If you're smart, you'll help him get medical attention and then leave this territory. If you're not smart, we can continue this and I guarantee you won't like the outcome." The 3 men exchanged glances, weighing options. They were hired help, not true believers in Hastings' grudge. After a moment of tense consideration, the nearest one nodded slowly and dismounted to help the wounded Hastings. "We'll be going," he said carefully. "No more trouble from us." Kane kept his weapon drawn but lowered as they collected Hastings, who was cursing in pain and humiliation, and helped him back onto his horse. The entire group turned and rode back the way they had come, moving quickly out of town. The confrontation had lasted less than 3 minutes from start to finish. Kane stood alone in the street, his weapon still in hand, feeling the familiar aftermath of adrenaline, the slight tremor in his muscles, the heightened awareness, the strange combination of relief and emptiness that always followed violence. But this time, something was different. Instead of the cold satisfaction of professional success, Kane felt primarily relief that no one had been seriously hurt, that Thomas would not have to learn of anyone's demise, that the town of Dry Creek could return to its peaceful routine. His concerns were not for his reputation or even his safety, but for the well-being of others. It was a profound shift, one that signaled just how much Thomas Walker's innocent respect had changed him. In the days following the confrontation with Hastings, Amos Kane made a series of decisions that would have been unthinkable to him just weeks earlier. Each decision moved him further from the legendary gunfighter identity he had maintained for over a decade, and closer to something more human, more connected, and ultimately more fulfilling. First, he met with Samuel Porter and formally offered his services to Dry Creek, not as a hired gun, but as someone willing to help maintain order and safety for the community. He emphasized that he sought no special payment beyond what he needed for basic living expenses, and that he wanted to be part of the town rather than apart from it. Porter, surprised but pleased, accepted the offer. "We could use someone with your experience," he said. "But Mr. Kane, if you're staying, you need to understand that being part of a community means more than just protection. It means attending church socials, helping with barn raisings, participating in town decisions. Are you prepared for that kind of involvement?" Kane smiled slightly, an expression that was becoming more common on his previously impassive face. "I think I'd like to try, Mr. Porter. It's been a long time since I've been part of anything larger than myself." Second, Kane had a long, honest conversation with Sarah Walker about his past, his losses, and his uncertainties about the future. He felt she deserved to know who he truly was if he was going to continue spending time with her family. Sarah listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and ultimately offered a perspective that Kane found both challenging and liberating. "Mr. Kane," she said gently, "you've been treating your past like a prison sentence you must serve alone. But grief shared becomes manageable. Connection doesn't guarantee more pain. Isolation guarantees a life half-lived. Thomas and we've both experienced loss too. We understand that loving people means risking loss, but we also understand that the alternative is no life at all." Her words articulated what Kane had been unable to express to himself, that his defensive isolation, while protective, had rendered his existence hollow. True courage was not avoiding vulnerability, but accepting it as the price of meaningful connection. Third, Kane began actively working with Thomas, not just helping around the homestead, but genuinely mentoring the boy. He taught Thomas practical skills, tracking, shooting, assessing situations. But more importantly, he taught him values, the importance of protecting those weaker than oneself, the obligation to use strength responsibly, the understanding that true courage often means choosing peace over violence. Thomas absorbed these lessons eagerly, and Kane discovered that teaching gave him a sense of purpose that his gunfighting career never had. He was investing in someone's future, helping shape a young person who might carry forward better values than the ones Kane's generation had often displayed. Perhaps most significantly, Kane began the psychological work of forgiving himself. With Sarah's gentle encouragement, he started to understand that he was not responsible for the losses he had suffered, not his family's deaths during the war, not his wife and son's deaths from fever. These tragedies were the result of difficult circumstances, not personal failure. His guilt had been a way of maintaining connection to the lost, but it was time to honor them by living more fully rather than by punishing himself indefinitely. The story of Amos Kane offers profound insights into human nature, particularly regarding how we respond to trauma, construct identity, and navigate the tension between self-protection and authentic living. His journey from isolated legend to connected human being illustrates several important principles about personal transformation. First, Kane's story demonstrates that identity is not fixed. For years, he believed he was fundamentally the solitary gunfighter, that this identity was his true nature. But Thomas Walker's innocent respect revealed that Kane contained other possibilities, capacity for nurturing, teaching, protecting in ways that built, rather than simply defended. The person we believe ourselves to be is often a construction built from circumstances and choices, not an unchangeable essence. Second, Kane's experience shows that transformation requires courage of a different kind than physical bravery. Facing armed opponents was familiar territory for Kane, frightening perhaps, but known. Opening himself to connection, risking the possibility of loss again, required a courage he had to develop specifically for this challenge. The bravery to be vulnerable is perhaps the most difficult kind. Third, the story illustrates how profoundly we can be affected by how others perceive us. Thomas saw potential goodness in Kane that Kane himself had stopped believing existed. That perception, that faith from an innocent observer, created space for Kane to grow into something better. We are not only what we believe ourselves to be, but also what others help us discover we might become. Fourth, Kane's journey shows that healing from trauma is not about forgetting or moving on, but about integration. He did not forget his lost family or minimize his grief. Instead, he learned to carry that grief without allowing it to completely determine his present and future. The past became part of his story, rather than the entirety of it. Finally, Kane's transformation reminds us that it is never too late for change. At an age when many people feel their patterns are set, Kane demonstrated remarkable capacity for growth. The factors that enabled this growth, unexpected challenge to his self-perception, genuine connection with others, and willingness to risk vulnerability, are available at any stage of life. 6 months after Amos Kane first rode into Dry Creek pursuing Jack Marlowe, the town had changed, and so had Kane. He had purchased a small property on the edge of town, established himself as a respected community member, and continued his mentorship of Thomas Walker. His reputation as a shooter remained intact, but it had become less central to his identity and more simply a skill he possessed among others. Sarah Walker's health had improved considerably, and while Kane's relationship with her remained respectful and somewhat formal, there was a growing warmth between them that suggested possibilities neither was rushing to define. Thomas had become like a son to Kane, not a replacement for the boy he had lost, but a new relationship valuable in its own right. The legend of Amos Kane, the gunfighter, still circulated in stories told in distant saloons and around campfires. But in Dry Creek, people knew Amos Kane, the neighbor, the mentor, the man who helped with barn raisings and attended church socials, who was learning to laugh more easily, and who no longer wore his weapon with quite the same constant readiness. The transformation was not complete or perfect. Kane still struggled with old habits of emotional distance. He still experienced moments of anxiety about loss. He still sometimes wondered if he deserved the life he was building. But he was learning that imperfection was part of being human, that struggling with these challenges while remaining connected to others was far better than the false perfection of isolation. Thomas Walker, now 9 years old and growing steadily, understood that he had played a role in Kane's transformation, though he could not articulate exactly how. He simply knew that the impressive stranger who had arrived in town months ago had become someone important to him, someone who cared about him and his mother, someone who was teaching him what it meant to be a good man. On a quiet evening in late autumn, as Kane sat on the porch of the Walker homestead watching Thomas practice the skills they had been working on, Sarah joined him with 2 cups of coffee. "You seem peaceful," she observed. Kane considered this. "I suppose I am. It's strange. For so many years I thought peace meant absence of threat, complete control of my circumstances. But this, sitting here, watching Thomas, knowing you're nearby, this is peace even though I can't control everything, even though there are still risks and uncertainties. That's the only kind of peace that's real," Sarah said gently. "The kind that exists alongside life, not in isolation from it." Thomas completed his practice and ran over to them, excited to demonstrate his improvement. As Kane critiqued the boy's technique with patience and encouragement, he reflected on how far he had come from the man who had let his weapon fall in the dust because a child called him Sir. That moment had been the beginning of his disarmament, not just the physical dropping of his gun, but the gradual dismantling of all the defensive barriers he had constructed around his heart. The process had been difficult, often painful, and still ongoing, but it had also returned him to life, to genuine human connection, to the possibility of meaning beyond mere survival. Amos Kane would always be known in history and legend as one of the fastest shooters the West had ever seen. But his truest victory was not any confrontation with armed opponents. It was the victory over his own fear, His willingness to be disarmed by innocence and trust, his courage to risk his heart again, despite knowing that loss was inevitable in a mortal life. In the end, the greatest shooter in Texas was defeated not by a faster gun, but by a child's simple word of respect, and in that defeat, he finally found the victory he had needed all along, the chance to be not just a legend, but a man, fully alive and genuinely connected to the world around him.